Hello, everyone. Welcome. That intro never gets old for me. It jazzes me up. I love it. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our August ICology Presents live stream. We had a little summer vacation in July, as everyone should, and we are back and back at it. I am joined by Ashley, Allison, and Ray today. Everybody wave, say hello. They are all three of these amazing internal communicators are, of course, also ICology members. And so in the spirit of ICology, I'm also going to plug the most amazing event you're ever going to attend in your communications life, and it is called Camp ICology. So before we get into our broadcast, I would love for people to join us at Camp ICology. It's September 21st and 22nd in Chicago. It is an in-person event. It is criminal that we have not had an in-person event yet, but we're on it now. So you can find more information at joinicology.com per usual. Now on to the good stuff. Welcome, everyone. I would love to hear in the comments where everyone is joining us from. And I would also love a little, maybe some hands raised about who has dealt with a crisis at work as an internal communicator and maybe what your experience was like. I would love to know that from the people who are joining us today on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and on Twitter. So welcome, everyone. I'm Kristen Hancock, in case anyone has not figured that part out yet. I am what should I call myself? The mastermind, maybe, of ICology? I don't know. We'll call myself whatever I like. And I am thrilled to be hosting this panel of three fantastic communicators. We're going to talk about everyone stay calm. We're going to be having a good conversation. I will say before we do any introductions that some of the topics that we cover today, given that it is dealing with crisis situations, are potentially emotionally fraught conversations. So as a heads up for everyone who is joining us, some of these conversation topics can be a bit heavy just given that they are crisis situations. So I will put that out there at the beginning. Zahid is joining us. Hello, Zahid. Welcome, welcome. I'm not sure what the quotation marks for Ray. I'm not sure what this is. This an inside joke?
I'm not quite sure. We need to catch up on what the quotation marks are for.
I need to understand the quotation marks. This is too funny. Okay, Ashley, why don't you introduce yourself first? Ashley Council is joining us here. Go for it.
Hi, y'all. My name is Ashley Council. I'm the Corporate Communications Manager at Blue Links Corporation. We're based here in the Metro Atlanta area in Marietta, Georgia. I've been an internal communicator for about a decade now, very focused on the employee populations, keeping them engaged and informed about what's happening in my organization. I spent the first 8 or so years of my career in healthcare with Piedmont Healthcare here in Atlanta, Georgia, primarily, but constantly growing. I've also had some experience in manufacturing and now in building materials.
Awesome. Love it. Ray, why don't you go next?
Great. Thank you, Kristen. And hello, everyone. My name is Ray Bachnight. I am based out of Lansing, Michigan, the home of the Michigan State Spartans. I'm a strategy director with First Up. And as a strategy director, I guide customers on how to accelerate the value of our platform to its fullest. So I serve pretty much as a communication consultant. Prior to joining First Up 2 years ago, I led the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services Communications Office. And then prior to that, I worked for MGM Resorts International in several different areas. So I have a background in corporate communications and marketing, PR, several different areas. So just delighted to be joining this conversation today.
And we are delighted to have you. And I will now let us know. Now, Zahid has clarified. He has the captions are on in LinkedIn, okay? And so you are R-A-Y, Ray, okay?
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks for catching where this is coming from. When I say Zahid, apparently it's Z-A-H-I-D, or for Americans it would be Z-A-H-I-D. Anyway, we've clarified now where the quotation marks have come from. Thank you for clarifying that. We were all confused. Allison, you're up.
Sounds good. Thanks. My name's Allison Ellis, and I'm coming to you from Calgary, Alberta in Canada. My background, started in communications in school and then sort of somehow landed in marketing. And then when I kind of got into a director level role really started to blend the two ideas together and really, brought a sense of marketing into internal communications, which lo and behold is a thing. Who knew? I was an island of my own and had no clue. I've largely been in the energy sector, which for those who aren't familiar with it's extremely volatile. It has major highs, it has major lows, it has disruptions from geopolitical factors that you see coming or don't see coming. And it's in some ways it's a bit of an adrenaline game. In Calgary, obviously head office mecca for the energy sector, but the companies I've been with, which have sort of had employees in that 300 to 750 people size, have largely been distributed across Canada and the US. The company I'm currently with is one called Compass Energy Systems. We build, which is industrial manufacturing. Our products can be found around the globe. Head office is Calgary, but we've got a large group in Houston as well. And yeah, it's I love the people in energy. I've sort of had a different hats in there, spent a bit of time in tech, but the call of clean energy and just things that were happening in this space really attracted me back, which is kind of fun to see. So looking forward to this conversation. Sadly, I've been through a few things, so we'll see where we go.
And also, obviously, I had to have a Canadian on the call, and Erica's pointed out, ooh, Calgary. I don't know what that means. I don't know if that's exciting. I'm not sure, but I agree. Ooh, Calgary, very exciting. One thing I want to point out to everyone who is watching this, all three of these amazing communicators on this call, when I reached out to them, said, yeah, I don't know if I'm not really an expert. I don't really have a lot of experience in crisis comms. And I was like, that's interesting. Then I'm chatting with Ray and I'm like, Ray, you've got to be on this webinar. Like it's going to be great. I really want you as part of this panel. He says the same thing. Yeah, I don't know if that's really like my area of expertise. I'm like, you worked at a health department during a pandemic. It doesn't get much more textbook crisis than that. He's like, oh yeah, that's right. And then when all three of us get on the call, Ashley says, oh, actually, my background was healthcare as well during the pandemic. And both of them were like, maybe we've tried to block this out. Maybe that's why we're like, no, we haven't really been involved. Allison said the same thing. That I'm like, weren't there wildfires in Calgary when you were there? Oh yeah, that's right. So I share this with everyone because I think that internal communicators are often the last people to promote our own expertise. So that's part of it. And also, I think when we are involved in crisis situations, when you're in the thick of it, you might not use that language to call it that. And maybe that's a hesitation, right, wrong, whatever. But I think it's important for us to recognize that many of us have likely been a part of crisis situations from the inside of organizations, but maybe we just didn't call it a crisis situation, or maybe we've blocked some of that from what we want to remember from our professional experience. So the first point of conversation I want to start off with today is just that, is defining what do we mean by a crisis situation. And when we first started having a conversation offline a couple weeks ago when we were planning this, Ray defined it as the moment you realize things won't go back to normal. And I love that explanation of it. And Ray, I wonder if you might be able to share a little bit about where that came from.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kristen. And I think you're 100% right. I'm still blocking out parts of the experience of fighting COVID and from a health department standpoint. Where that came from, it came from when we realized that COVID had arrived to the States and to Michigan. And the way that our team was operating, we couldn't operate the same way in order to inform the public of what was going on, inform our employees as well. So it's almost a new normal that when you realize, okay, and you have to recognize that point, that you are in a new place, a new normal. And because of that, you have to begin to change your mode of operations. You need to change your priorities. And you need to change the way in which your team is working with each other in order to address the crisis. So that is one of the key takeaways for me. It's getting to a place where it's your organization and your team has defined, we are in a crisis and we need to change the way we are operating.
How early would you say that happened for, I'll pose this question to all three of you. How early into a crisis or how late into a crisis would you say that moment has happened?
I would say for us, I think related to COVID, I think I'll say there are a couple moments in which we came to realization we needed to change things. So there's when the state announced an emergency, right? And the state began to, when I say the state, all the key departments involved in the COVID response recognized that we needed to reorganize and address things. But then I remember there was a second moment when within our department and within our communications team, we began to take on the brunt of the responsibility to respond. So it's almost like at first the organization recognizing and defining the crisis, and then within the organization, the team that you're part of, recognizing that. But I would say first for us, it was pretty early on in the stages of things because people recognized COVID was coming. And then secondly, I think it was probably weeks after that where we recognized, okay, the way that we were operating, we really needed to change things up.
Yeah, and I will second Ray's notion that, there may be more than one point at which you realize that, because there's the knowing that this thing is happening, it's going on now. There's knowing what kind of responsibilities you're going to take in it. And then depending on the type of organization you're in, it's the response for people outside of you. So working in healthcare in the beginning, there were so many things that were constantly shifting and changing for our caregivers that, we had to be very rapid in our response as well. And those things just continue to change. And so I will agree that, yeah, there were these multiple points where we're like, okay, there's this thing called COVID. Wait, it's having a pretty big impact, not only in our communities, but definitely in our healthcare facilities as well. And so definitely agree with Ray on that point.
Yeah, I think in specifics to COVID, I'm coming from I wasn't in healthcare. We were coming from our own business. We were in our own bubble. There was a sense of disbelief because I know kind of early around March 4th, started talking to the CEO and saying, like, this is coming. Like, I've got friends in healthcare who are, getting ready to hunker down in their homes for 2 weeks. And, like, are we ready? And there was a sense of like, well, I don't want to panic the team, right? And sort of like, wait. And then for us, we had, it sort of bubbled up. And to your point, just sort of happened overnight where a team member who just returned from Europe had a headache. And we didn't know what that meant. And, the next thing you know, we're all sent home and we're all like then trying to make sense of it. And it was just sort of really like a light switch of like, okay, well, how do we run our business? But there was a resistance because the executive team didn't want to panic the broader group, but yet we could see it coming, which in hindsight, it's sort of like, if only we'd sort of gotten it sooner. But yeah, it's sort of a light switch for sure.
I think that's an interesting point. And this is maybe somewhat veering off of where my intention to go next was, but the reluctance to call something a crisis can grossly impact the response that you have. Bit of a unique situation in that Ray and Ashley were in healthcare at the time. I'm going to go out on a limb, but correct me if I'm wrong. If you worked in healthcare at the time, you may have had more of a medical science related response to, okay, we have experts on our team, this is what they do, and they are telling us to be concerned, versus the energy sector, manufacturing, retail, whatever other sectors where you're like, well, is it really? Like, maybe this will just impact hospitals, or maybe this, there's that reluctance. I'd love to know if any of you have experience in dealing with what Allison just talked about, where there's reluctance to call it a crisis, whether we're talking about COVID or something else, because you don't want people to panic. And where that line is between being open and honest with the severity of the situation versus being inflammatory and potentially causing people to panic a little bit.
In my experience, I wouldn't say there is reluctance. I think in public health, we err on the side of informing and letting people know what's happening rather than holding back information and being mindful that, concerned that we're just going to cause panic. Um, I think because in public health, it's a strong belief that we should provide the public with the information of what's happening the best that we can in order for them to understand the risk within the context that we are painting. So in the world of public health that I've been a part of, I wouldn't say that there was that reluctance because we were so used to addressing crises one after another, and it was, I would say, almost at the in our mode of operation to as quickly deliver the information once we received it and we were able to validate the accuracy of it.
Yeah, and I will agree with that, particularly when it comes to COVID. I haven't had direct experience of people being more reluctant, calling it a crisis, but I have heard from, my network stories of, well, our leadership believes wearing a mask is a personal opinion. Like that's a personal viewpoint that one should be able to choose. And this is not like today. This is a little bit earlier in the pandemic where, I heard stories of leaders who were threatening to quit if, masks were going to be required, and different stories like that. So it caught me off guard a bit, having worked in healthcare and having a pretty straightforward view when it comes to this is in the interest of public health versus this is what someone desires to do. I think that there are some very clear lines that have to be drawn. And when they aren't, it can lead to a lot of confusion for employees.
And on that note, Ashley, one of the things that you've mentioned before is the concept of having a single source of truth when it comes to a crisis response. Can you talk a little bit more about your experience with that concept?
Absolutely. So at Piedmont, there was a very strong desire to create a single source of truth where employees could go to find whatever answers they needed. And during my time there, we actually moved to a more modern intranet that served as that single source of truth even prior to COVID. So if there was a newsletter, it linked to the single source of truth most times. For long form articles and other information that employees needed, for departmental or organizational information that employees were looking for, the intranet served as that single source of truth. And so when COVID came, it became even more imperative that we stick to that format. And so we really developed an area within our intranet we had a landing page where you could you could click on different topics and go to the information you needed. And so having that for employees, particularly as, the ways that the processes that they needed to engage in were changing and evolving, sometimes daily, was super important because it allowed us the ability to transition that information as needed without a lot of interruption to the employees.
Ray, I'm gonna ask you this because I think it's interesting now that you are working for a potential solutions provider for those kinds of situations. Are there customers that you are seeing who are employing this single source of truth mantra, I guess, and in their technology using platforms?
Yeah, I definitely think that's the case. It's um, where's a place that individuals can go to collect assets and information that they need in order to carry forth their message. And in my previous life, that was always something that was difficult because the tools that we had available, and you're probably not surprised, the government doesn't have the most innovative tools, but challenges information being spread absolutely everywhere. And when that happens and you don't have that single source of truth, that's when misinformation takes place. which is like your worst enemy when it comes to a crisis situation, right? But when it comes to a platform such as what we have with First Up, is all that information can be contained in one place that serves as a single source of truth, where the content, the assets, and messaging can be contained in order to deliver that the message in response to the crisis quickly, effectively, and accurately. So I definitely see that being in the case with some of our customers.
Yeah, yeah. And I imagine there are companies who learned to rely on software and platforms more than they probably intended to as a result of COVID. And there are probably companies who went, oh crap, we don't have anything. We have no single way of communicating, or it's not efficient, it's not fast enough, it doesn't reach everyone, whatever that might be. Allison, did you have a tool that was it intranet or some email that you used in communicating?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So in our world at that time, we had 23 branches or offices spread across Canada and the U.S. with many of our employees just operating out of a truck, often in remote locations where they were in and out of service areas. So relying on an intranet, while that's a critical tool in the toolbox, it can't be the main one because otherwise we just don't reach these folks. So I think we started with a town hall call where we sort of got everybody on the line. The messaging came from the CEO, and then from there it became a CEO message daily at the start, and then we sort of kind of went every other day, and sort of would craft something based on sort of what had changed or what policies we had done. And he was our single source of truth. So he was, and we were careful, like it came from him. It came from his email. It didn't come from his executive assistant. It was him copying and pasting, and then, adding the things in, whether it was like, an EAP, like HR plug, for mental health support or childcare, or even, and then we also from there coached our senior leadership team on their teams. Like, here's what we need to do. Here's what you need to do. You need to understand the family situations. You need to understand if people are set up to work from home. Do they have childcare? And figuring those pieces out. But yeah, we really relied on email, and it was our CEO who was the voice. And then the other pieces supported it, and made it accessible because not everybody was online.
I would love to know from all three of you, and I would also love to know from everyone who is joining us in the chat, the fiery chat area here. Have you ever been involved in a crisis and looked back and said, we probably communicated too much? No. Okay. just checking. Just wanted to make sure if anyone was like, yeah, we just put out way too much communication. It was over the top. Okay. All right. Any thoughts on that? Does anyone have any too much, too little communication experiences?
I think with so to answer your question, no, I don't think there's been a time, but it's very challenging to communicate the level that your audience needs and deserves, especially related to something like COVID, where things are constantly changing. And I know we keep leaning on COVID, but I think a lot of us can relate to that and understand how 1 minute we were saying masks were not required. Next minute we were saying masks are required. Then all of a sudden the schools shut down. It's like one thing after another, after another, after another. CDC changes guidelines. So when the federal government announces that, then the states need to change their approach, then the local jurisdictions. So the challenge that I've seen in communications is, how do you remain consistent with the most accurate information? And that was, I think, the biggest challenge that our team had, is how do we update the website as soon as the CDC changes guidelines? How do we deliver to the public what those new guidelines are? And how do we also keep our advertising, but also our employees informed on what those guidelines are? So if they're receiving calls from the public, that they can be sure to inform them accurately. So that's why I don't think you can ever communicate too much, as long as you are communicating according to the accuracy of information that you have.
Okay, this just in, breaking news. Ash is telling us, yes, in fact, there is a situation where she worked somewhere and they communicated too much. Now, to Ray's point, now I want to understand what once we actually Streisanded an issue, I assume is what that means, and it became a monster. I assume you're meaning Barbara Streisand. I'm not entirely sure what the reference is, so if anyone understands it better than I do, feel free to jump in. I'm assuming, though, I wonder if it wasn't so much over communication, maybe it was, to Ray's point, the accuracy, or maybe it was over communicating about something that wasn't a crisis in the first place. That may also be a possibility, because that maybe Ash in the comments can give us some more, or maybe privately after she wants to explain the story to us. One of the things, so we've talked about the difference between, for example, an explosive crisis versus a smoldering one. The unique thing about COVID is it sort of started off, well, maybe this is a bit North American centric, maybe started off as, to Allison's point, a bit of a like, oh, it's an over there issue, maybe smoldering, that we thought, oh, it's not going to impact us. Some people did, but maybe not everyone. And then became explosive very quickly, right? All of a sudden, boom, 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 things were shutting down, things were people were being sent home, all these kinds of things happened. And now I'm sure we can all agree, years later, it is still this smoldering crisis. It's still this problem. And the difference between the two. Now, Allison, you've been involved to jump from COVID to situations at work that were natural disaster crisis related. Would you call were those more like, boom, something happened right away, or more of a slow crisis that happened over time?
Both. In 2013, Calgary flooded, which I don't know if you remember, but our whole downtown core was underwater essentially, which shut down a majority of the head offices in downtown Calgary. We just couldn't get access to our building. Our building shut down, power, whatever. That one really happened overnight. We knew the water was high, but we never dreamed it would breach or flood the downtown core. So, I mean, a lot of our team had left without computers, and like laptops were sitting on desks, including myself. I now bring my laptop with me every night. But we also went through the Fort McMurray wildfires, which were a huge thing, a huge chunk of that community. People lost homes. Several of our employees lost homes. But in that case, I would say it was smoldering. We saw it coming. It was a little bit like COVID. You're sort of watching it. You're aware of it. You're sort of ready to take action. We were communicating with employees, be safe, get out, exercise caution. And, for the most part, yes, it was a crisis and we had to manage it and we had to support those employees through that and sort of the branch. But with the flood, it was like business continuity, which luckily we had a secondary head office in Denver. So we sort of leaned on them. But then we did old-fashioned call trees. We had to check in on employees, make sure they were safe, made sure they had places to stay. And then make sure they had a way to get into the system. Because, it was 2013, so remote was available, but only a handful of employees, those who traveled, were sort of using it. So now it was, when COVID hit, we knew how to operate remote. It was sort of a non-issue in that regard. But yeah, I saw both sides where kind of overnight you're like, oh my God, we got to figure this out. And then sort of we saw it coming and sort of then could address it appropriately.
And do you think that from those, it's funny you say, oh, now I bring my laptop home with me every night. Is that directly, are there lessons that the three of you have learned that are directly related to living through those experiences at employers?
Well, I would say one of my first memories of Piedmont is arriving, and on my desk there was a little key fob, because at that time we needed it for remote access. This is day one, and so it was a situation where we were always set up to be able to work from wherever we needed to, because in the event that, in a healthcare system where you're providing care and there is something that needs to be communicated, access shouldn't be a barrier. And so what I'll say about COVID is one of the things that kind of happened there is, some people were remoting from their laptop into their desktop. Some people. But I was also fortunate that, unlike others, I didn't have the experience of my desktop shut down. And so now I can't remote into the system. And so there are all these little nuances that really have to be considered when you're talking about having the ability to do your job when you need to and where you need to. So it's definitely something, that more people are cognizant of now because of that situation.
Ray, you're nodding.
Yeah, I would just echo what Ashley was saying and what Allison is saying. Now, some of the things I'm trying to unlearn coming through these crises,
Yeah, I want to know
to
about
be,
that too.
we'll talk about that later on. But understanding that at any point there could be a crisis that would hit the state tied to the Department of Health and Human Services. The question was, do I have access to the tools I need in order to jump in and respond? And with us being the topic, with the crisis, stay calm, that actually gave me a level of calm, just to know that I did have access to the tools and had access to individuals in order to help with that response.
So let this be a lesson to everyone in internal comms. If you have a laptop at work, take it home with you every
I
night.
had to go buy one. Like that's how
Did
it
you really?
because like the office, we couldn't get access to the office for over 10 days. Like there was just no access. Because when a big tower shuts down, it takes days for it to get back online and to have it people safely enter. Like so even though the floodwaters have subsided, we still couldn't get access to the building. So I mean, I went to Costco and I bought a new personal laptop, for $1,000 just to kind of make sure I could still do stuff and get access to my email and whatever else, because otherwise I was doing everything from my BlackBerry at the time.
Yeah.
So I do take my laptop home every night because you just never know.
I wonder too, there are probably companies, this is a little aside from my last corporate job in Canada, and the place that I was working was semi-government. To Ray's point earlier, government doesn't always have all the tools and the bells and whistles. They're also pretty bureaucratic. There's a lot of layers of, approvals and things to get through. Anyway, all this to say, when I worked there, they were very strict about there was no remote work as an option. And there was even for people lower than C-suite to have access to email outside of your physical office did not happen. It was very, very restrictive. And now I left long before COVID became a thing, but it's so funny. I've kept in touch with some people there who were like, yeah, we had to adapt quickly. So there's the physical office part of it, to Allison's point about you can't physically get access to the office. And then there's the IT infrastructure part of it as well, where if your people were not set up to be able to work remotely before, never mind if they had a physical space in their home, but also do they even have the ability to access email and get into software and all of those kinds of programs. And at the time I didn't. And it was funny because they always said, oh, no, we can't do that. It's not an option for our organization. And then wouldn't you know it, it became an option out of necessity. So I think there are a lot of organizations who likely learned the hard way that they had to make those things available and accessible for employees because it wasn't an option to be at work. On the thread of learning lessons, I would love to know if there's people. So here, Zahid's saying experienced instances where they created issues because communications were not tailored for main audience. So that's good, using big words and jargon for faculty, which didn't translate well for students. That's interesting. Yes, and we communicated. That should be the checkbox of a lot of unfortunately executive people who maybe don't have a background in comms. Well, we said something. Well, that's not always good enough. I would love to know, are there lessons that you have taken? Now, Ray, we had talked about before, not in great detail, but taking lessons from working at MGM Resorts to the state in terms of keeping employees motivated, or I guess engaged maybe is a word too, during times of crisis?
Yeah, something that was interesting that occurred both at my time at MGM Resorts and the State Health Department is that both entities coincidentally, right before the crisis hit, launched a brand campaign for the organization. So the crisis that I'm referring to at MGM Resorts is the October 1 shooting, which you all have probably heard about, the individual um, that shot into a musical festival across the street from Mandalay Bay. Um, the interesting thing is, shortly before that, we launched this brand campaign that helped to define the organization as well as who the employees were to the organization, like the value that they brought. We did the exact same thing at the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, where we defined the value that each employee brought, which was bringing hope. So one key takeaway I saw with that is the power that building a brand identity among your employees plays when it comes to working through a crisis, and that in both scenarios we anchored our communications to employees and we anchored the really narrative internally in the values of the organization to remind our individuals who we are as an organization and how they were delivering on the mission of the company and the importance of that. And I felt like that really was a motivator, especially when it came to the state and COVID, because we had framed this idea that we were bringing hope even before COVID. And then with the crisis, that became even more of a reality that everything we were doing, we were working to save lives and bring hope to individuals. And that helped. That was one way of keeping individuals motivated. Not to say a brand campaign entirely will do just that, but that was an interesting observation. So I would say a takeaway is consider what your internal narrative is for your employees right now, so you're not catching up during a crisis trying to define who they are. You have well defined who they are before that crisis hits, so you're just reminding them as a motivating.
Like using your employer brand as an anchor of sorts, right? That you can tie to, and that people have that sense of identity before you're then scrambling to figure that out during a time of crisis.
Exactly.
Ashley, you are relatively new in your role right now. I'm curious if there are lessons you've taken from previous crisis situations that you're now building into a strategy where you are now.
Well, so I'll say that crisis probably looks different in different types of organizations. So we don't see the same level of crisis communications. But one of the things that I'm very adamant about is ensuring access to communications for all employees. So I think it's very common for organizations to have employees who are, based at a desk, and then also a subset of that population who don't work at a desk, who don't use computers to do their daily work. And so I've seen this as a challenge in probably every organization I've worked in, but some organizations are just a little further along than others. And so in my current organization, I am actually the first internal communications professional that they've ever had. So before it's been more, well, we need marketing activities, and that was the bulk of what was coming out related to communications. And that one person was also doing the best she could to keep people informed. But there is a very clear distinction among people who are at their computers every day and those who aren't. So in my current organization, the people who don't sit at a computer, they don't have SSO, they don't have company email addresses. And that's common in some industries, but it also can lead to these kind of communication blockages where you're not able to directly communicate with those employees. And I think that for employee engagement or experience or whatever we're calling it today, it's very important for employees to feel connected to the organization and also to feel like they're getting the best information at all times directly from the organization versus, well, my manager said XYZ. I would love to build up to a place where whatever our singular source of truth is, our employees have that access to company information.
You're getting applause on LinkedIn, Ashley, and this is from Ash. She would like more Ashleys in internal comms. Coincidentally, Ash's full name happens to be Ashley as well, and so I think there's some kind of there might be a club, I think, for you is what I'm saying. Maybe there's a fan club kind of thing. Yeah.
Hey, look, I'm a fan of Ash as well because, it's funny because sometimes I call myself this, but it's also something I've been known for in my career. I'm a woman of the people.
Love
And
it.
so I just feel like everyone's included in that.
I love it. I love it. That's the takeaway message from today is access to communication for everyone, 100%. Allison, what are lessons that you've taken from your experience in some of those crisis situations into your role now?
Yeah, I think similar to what Ray was saying in that anchoring to whatever your employer messaging is. For me, I've typically worked with a lot of values-based organizations. So leaning on those values or guiding principles or mission, whatever it might be, they were tremendous just to kind of to kind of anchor back to those when we needed to. I think one of the things that came out of the flood was people were sort of in disbelief when they went back to work, and there was sort of, they had friends or family who'd been impacted. We ended up reaching out and doing something through one of the local, nonprofit organizations. And as a team, we went out and we cleaned up homes, sprayed for mold, did things. And it was sort of a good engagement way for our downtown core office to, give back, heal a little bit, and feel like we did something that wasn't necessarily just on our personal time. So that was sort of something that really benefited out of it. So if there's opportunities like that, I would say snatch them because they do go a long way. And funny enough, like that group that went through those handful of things, like there's so much camaraderie that's come out of sort of navigating that stuff. That's been good. And then similar to Ashley, like I'm with you in that, access for all. That's sort of an advocate. I'm with an organization that launched an intranet with the thinking of giving access to all, but actually what ended up doing is we just created a really poor user experience. So I'm sort of rethinking that and sort of how do you get content to or messages to those employees who don't have an email or don't have the best access, and really looking at who their personas are and sort of what drives them and what's the best tools for them. So yeah, those are a couple of things.
I'm curious when you talk about the giving back part of it. It's funny. One of the topics that I want to bring up in a couple of months is employee philanthropy and employees giving back. But I think we would be remiss if we did not talk about the impact that working through a crisis situation has on internal communicators who are tasked with communicating the messages, right? So you may not be the medical professional directly involved in making COVID recommendations, but you are tasked with sharing those recommendations with everyone else, right? You might not be the person, tasked with the logistics of a crisis if there's a mass shooting in your workplace or if there is a wildfire or other natural disaster, but you are the person who's tasked with sharing the messages about that after the fact or during the situation. So what are the ways that communicators can take care of themselves during those times? And I will also add to that question, maybe there are situations where you acknowledge you did not take care of yourself and what you would have done differently.
I would say, I think there's definitely a level of personal responsibility where you need to be aware of what's happening with you and the things that you need to do to take care of yourself. And in particular, I'm going to quote a couple of former supervisors. One would tell me, no little elves are going to come in and do your work. As in, it will be here when you start fresh tomorrow. And then, another supervisor told me during COVID, actually, you're too available. You're responding too quickly, and I need you to, step back because you're online for long periods of time, which it became actually very easy for me to do that when I first started working from home fully remotely. I'm single, I don't have children. And so I was now like in this space where I'm accustomed to spending several hours a day with other people. And suddenly I'm at home, like looking at the walls. So it's like, well, why not just go ahead and respond to that email? Why not just do XYZ? And so I think there is definitely a level of personal awareness that we all have to develop. But I will say that if you're a communicator who is also managing others, you'll see the signs that you may need to share with your team members that they should take care of themselves as well.
There's a lot of leading by example, I imagine, for those as well. One of my pet peeves is managers who say, who send emails late in the evening, but the email says, you don't have to respond. I'm just sending this because I just want to get it off my plate, or I want, whatever, wait till tomorrow, without recognizing the power dynamic of your boss sending you an email at 9 o'clock at night and you feeling like you need to respond, even if they tell you you don't. So I think there's a lot of leading by example that we could all do. Ray, what about you?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts in response to that. The first one, and it goes back to the first question of defining crisis. I think we call a lot of things crises that are not, quite honestly. And I think we have to get it into a place generally in the work environment on what is really, really urgent and what things aren't urgent. And coming to an understanding for me that not everything is urgent helped me establish boundaries in how I operated. Quite honestly, I think COVID. I joke around about how mentally distressing that was. It has actually helped me to become a healthier team member. I think because I was forced to establish certain boundaries by knowing that not everything is a crisis. So that's one thing. Is I would think first within a workplace, help people understand not everything's absolutely urgent. And you can do that by giving deadlines of when you actually need something and when you don't. Um, in addition to that, I think going to off of what Ashley said, the personal responsibility. For me, there were certain things I said, okay, this is going to be a boundary for me. I'm not going to work 7 days a week. Saturdays, I'm not going to do any work. Like, and even in the midst of COVID, I'm not unless it's absolutely necessary, and unless it falls into the definition of my definition of a crisis, I'm not going to work on a Saturday because I'm going to spend time with family on that. Another one is at lunch, I'm going to go for a walk as long as it's nice out, so that's what I'm going to do after this call. I'm going to go out for a walk. So there's certain things that I recognize I need in order to be a healthy individual and a strong contributor within the workplace. So I'd encourage team members to think about what are those things that you absolutely need and make those boundaries and communicate those boundaries.
I love that. I think healthy boundaries are a lot of people's nemesis. And we've got a comment here from Elena Moore. The sky is not falling. Though that's a great that's a great thing to remind yourself. And I think when you have had experience that we've talked about like on this call today of true crisis scenarios, if nothing else, it gives you perspective on what really is a crisis, right? And for many situations in communications, marketing, many things are not crisis situations. Many things are not. So, Allison, what about you?
Much what they said, boundaries was a big one. I think, one experience I went through was a hostile takeover, which initially feels like a massive crisis. And then you realize it plays out over many weeks. But the emotions in those first, 24, 48 hours, for everybody are real. Like, fear for my job. What does this mean? Like, did our competitor who we've hated for years just become my new boss? Like, it was very complex emotions. One of the best things I saw was an executive team, particularly the CEO, say, like, earnestly and heartfelt, like, I don't know, like, we're working on it. This is what we're doing. I'm going to be transparent about this process, but right now, I don't know. Like, because you had to, externally, we hired a communications firm that was an expert in hostile takeovers, and then internally, we had to pick and choose what was right to share and what the right timing of that was. But really, what ended up happening was it largely was a press release exercise going back and forth. We adopted some policies, which was called a poison pill. It's a defense strategy, but just sort of dilutes the interest in your company. And communicating that and explaining it to employees so they could understand. And then it just sort of went away. But that first, 48 hours to a week was really tough for people because, like, heads were spinning. What does this mean? And yeah, so you got to set boundaries at some point, but then you, to the point of, like, this isn't really an emergency anymore. We've done what we can. It's going to play out the way it's going to play out. We're going to keep communicating with you. We're going to be transparent as much as we can. But then you sort of just have to let it go to some extent. So.
Agreed. We've got a comment here from my partner in life and work, Chuck Ghost. And honest, I don't know is a powerful and helpful phrase for employees to hear. I think we can probably all agree with that. It's a simple phrase, but the honesty of it is helpful and also communicates that you've been heard, right? If you ask a question and someone says, I truly don't know the answer, then at least they know that you have heard the question that came across. So I will thank all of you for being part of this. This is an amazing conversation. We've recorded this for ICology members. So if you are an ICology member, you will have access to this in our community shortly, hopefully later today. Ashley, Ray, Allison, it is a delight to have these conversations with you. I know they are not easy. This is one of our less lighthearted conversations that we've had. So I appreciate you all being vulnerable, being honest, and sharing your experiences for other communicators. I know everyone has learned so much from this. So we will have another ICology Presents session in September. Until then, thank you all very much. Thanks to everyone who joined us today, and enjoy the rest of your week. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Kristen.